Support for this podcast comes from the patrons at patreon.com/FMLFPL. Okay, welcome to another Fireside Chat. This is Alon. Today I'm joined by Ted Knutson of the Transfer Flow. How you doing, Ted?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So before we dive into transfers, I guess it's a nice place to start. Maybe where can people follow you on social media, read, listen, watch your work? What's the deal with the Transfer Flow?
Long time mixed Knuts. So MIXEDKNUTS. It's a horrible pun that's been there for 30 years or something like that on my socials. And then I started the transferflow.com /subscribe, which gets you on our daily newsletter. I started that, I think, June of last year. And we're creeping up on 20,000 newsletter subscribers. We've got, we're working on 6K on YouTube as well. We've got a podcast we do a couple times a week there.
Awesome. Perfect. Let's talk about some new transfers. I think Villa are kind of weirdly a headline maker with these moves. So obviously they sell Duran, they make a ton of money. And then they bring in Malen, and then they loan in Asensio and Rashford. How are we understanding this? Like, what's happening with their front line there?
So I think that Villa, basically, they had some PSR problems. And I think Emery in particular was struggling to kind of keep Duran and Ollie Watkins both happy. And so Duran ended up having kind of the biggest price tag and was willing to go to Saudi Arabia for a couple of years. And so that deal got executed. But, they've been struggling a little bit on both sides of the ball. Like they have one of the worst goal differences of all the good teams. Now, it's not entirely surprising if you follow Emery's history at sort of better teams. Like it's actually fairly consistent. But I think they're kind of going for it on the Champions League. And that's what this looks like to me. Basically, they feel like they've gotten themselves out of their current PSR problems for the summertime with that big deal. And now they're like, okay, well, we still needed some firepower. Let's bring in some versatility, in particular in Asensio. Who I think does upgrade some of their options in midfield and can also potentially play up front. He's still pretty good, and because he's only on loan, that means that they're not on the hook for like all of his big contract or any fee after that. Now he has very large wages, as does Rashford, and the rumor was that they could be paying up to 90% of Rashford's wages based off of different escalators and clauses. I mean, when we were talking about on our podcast yesterday, I was like, that seems like even 75% seems like an insane number because nobody actually wanted Rashford. And the number of his wages is so big. The only way that it made sense to me was somebody paying like maybe a third of it, like basically Arsenal did with Raheem Sterling. Then we find out that it looks like it's at least 70% and possibly up to 90%. That's madness.
I don't really understand it. I guess I also don't really know how PSR works in terms of loans. I mean, I guess they're sitting on all this money.
It's just a cash flow thing.
Yeah, right. So they're just saying, we can just spend this money. It's all temporary anyway. And sort of like you throw enough dudes at a problem and see if one sticks. Maybe they just get they hit a hot streak for the last few months of the season, climb to Champions League spots or something.
I think Villa also just like their owners are fine funding losses, and so that's what you're seeing here. So they don't mind like the large numbers there. Malen, I think, was actually a pretty decent transfer, and they got a reasonable reasonable price bringing him in, and so you get kind of a wide attacker that can score, which is something that they've been looking for as well. More threats from the wide spaces as opposed to central. Rashford has obviously played out wide as well, so like that gives them kind of a double up on that. Although I think they basically play the same position most of the time. So clearly Villa have bolstered their potential attack, but whether their head coach is the type of head coach that's going to let them like willingly go after this, I'm not sure. So, my assessment is that they are going to get some playing time. Now they've got so many of them that from an FPL perspective, you're like, ooh, who's actually going to be in the starting lineup regularly? That's a scary bit. But given the way that the table looks right now, it does feel like this is mostly a Champions League setup and less so about them ratcheting their way back up into the Champions League spaces in the league.
Yeah. The only other thing I was thinking is maybe this means Ollie Watkins' injury is a little bit more serious than we thought.
They might have to just manage him more.
Yeah, because obviously Duran left. He winced off, grimacing at half. So maybe they're thinking, okay, we can't just run him into the ground here. But yeah,
they got a lot of matches, hopefully, for them, and they do have that bye for the Champions League midweeks that are coming up starting next week. I think pretty exciting actually. Those knockouts have some blockbuster elements.
Yeah, and one of those, good segue by you, is of course Man City, who spent tons of money in January. I didn't really see that coming, to be honest. I think from a fantasy perspective, Nico Gonzalez probably not adding that much unless he sort of solidifies the defense. But Marmoush looks really awesome, and he's just a total live wire, very exciting. It seems like I think he's cup tied in Champions League, so he's just going to start every league game, I assume.
He's at Frankfurt, right?
Yeah. I mean, what do you think about Marmoush? How'd you guys take that?
Yeah, we loved him. So Spurs actually should have had him in the summertime. Like he seemed like he was nailed on for that, and then something happened and they didn't take him. Potentially classic case anyway of Spurs not paying for a player that they scouted and thought they were really good. I think Marmoush is going to be excellent. And I actually think that he is going to cause Pep to change tactically a little bit. Like they might go a little big. They might go 3-5-2 and keep those two up front. Haaland had wanted to potentially sort of have a slightly bigger passing role. He didn't want to just always shoot. He feels like he's got that as part of his game. And so this gives an opportunity for that to shine as well. Also, Marmoush can play wide, and he's much more of a scoring threat than Dorgu was. Doku's an excellent dribbler, but it seems like he very rarely gets on the score sheet, especially with goals. I actually think so. From a tactical perspective, Nico Gonzalez is the most important player that they picked up.
Okay, tell me more.
They just don't have a good defensive midfielder, and they've struggled consistently. And so they needed somebody else that was a capable tackler, which he has been historically, but also quite good at build up. Very competent there at Porto. His numbers his underlying numbers were good to great. 23 years old too, so they've bought him at the right age for them to anchor. And City went out and they basically said, okay, we knew that we have needs. And unlike a lot of the teams that you see kind of noisy stuff, like you didn't hear anything about their deals until basically they were about to sign, until they're pretty much guaranteed. And I thought that was a very good January for them, especially given that a lot of teams didn't necessarily want to sell and they got good talent. Obviously, they paid for it, but they didn't pay like crazy prices. They weren't like up in the 100. Like they were in sort of the 50 to 60 range for the most part, and they've got some escalator clauses on that. So I think Marmoush is going to be excellent, and if you're FPL, you've got to be excited. They are going to have some matches, but you're right. He's going to play in the league. So I'm looking forward to that. Whether they're going to be fixed or not is a good question. But also from an FPL perspective, if they're not fixed, it means that they've got to step on the gas
score
and
more
attack
goals.
Consistently. Yep.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking the exact same thing. I mean, the one weird thing with the Nico Gonzalez, and maybe it's so complicated that they couldn't. It's surprising they didn't do it like the first week in January when they still had 5 games to go. Instead, they do it on basically the last day of the window. And
Porto didn't have to sell, and I think that they might have been working on other potential targets. And so he might not have been their first, or he might have been their first, and they just had to circle back to him. But they might not have initially liked the price.
Yeah. So many potential reasons there. So let's go Spurs. Tell seems awesome. I've barely ever seen him play. It seems like even Bayern fans have barely ever seen him play. He barely gets on the pitch for them too. But
he got a good amount of minutes last year. So 23-24, we saw like a good amount of minutes for him. 7 goals, 43 shots in the Bundesliga. There, kind of loves a wide forward, but can play both sides as well. So we see some shots from the other side as well.
Yeah. Is he just do you see him more as just they're punting on it and maybe there's something there? They have the option to buy. Do you think there's actually a chance they push that through? I think it was like 55 million or 60 million or something like that.
I thought the option to buy was possibly the most important part of that deal, and it wouldn't have gone through if they didn't get it. So what Spurs would not have wanted to do was basically put him on in the shop window for everybody else to be like, oh, he's awesome, and not have the ability to execute that deal. He plays the same position as Son most of the time, or Brennan Johnson. So like those are like the two spots that he plays. And those players are both very good, but Son we know is getting up there in age. And this is a little bit of try before you buy. They're not getting him for cheap necessarily, but they might be getting him for good. And if they like him enough, and if he's a player that they're happy to have around, they've at least given themselves protection there. The question for me is like, how much is he going to play? I think he'll play some, and I think they have a lot of minutes to sort of spread around as well. But you know, in the league, like you got to be really careful about your lineups and who's in and who's out.
Yeah, I mean, can he play centrally? It seems like, you know, I'm basing a lot of this off of, you know, sort of like his FB ref positional notation or whatever. And sometimes they have him as forward, sometimes left wing, sometimes right wing. So I thought maybe, you know, with the Solanke injury, maybe he'll get some minutes as striker too.
Oh, or they shift Son, which I actually think probably makes more sense. If Son is, like, they don't want him to do as many high-speed sprints, and he knows the system fairly well, this allows them to have more of a wild card out wide. It is a little bit rotational. Mostly what we've seen from him is largely in the wide spaces, and he's been good in a dominant Bundesliga team. Can he be great? Is a really interesting question, but you know that it's only a loan, so they get a little protection there too.
It's just fun when a dude has so few minutes and the shot numbers are huge and the goal numbers are huge, and it's like, oh my god, what could this be? You know, it could be anything.
But we used to see things like that with City, where they would have academy kids come through. PSG is another one, and they'll give them sort of like garbage minutes to be able to play against weaker competition and bulk up the stats there. Then they're like, oh, we're hoping that somebody takes them because they're not our number one choice. And how well will they do elsewhere? Well, we're willing to take that.
Yeah, almost all of his goals last year were sub minutes. He comes on for like 11 minutes and gets a goal, and they're already up 5-1 or something. I thought one of the more interesting ones was Brighton loaning Evan Ferguson back to Potter and West Ham. I don't know if there was an option to buy there. I couldn't actually find like something really concrete on that. How are you understanding that move for them, for Brighton and for West Ham?
So Fulkrug's status is tricky. He's been injured basically the whole year. They probably shouldn't have made that purchase. They got rid of the director that signed him as well. So that's usually a sign that was a big mistake. Ferguson, I also haven't seen whether there's a buy option in it, but I think for Brighton, it makes a ton of sense. They're giving him to a coach that they know quite well and that the player knows well too. And so they're hoping to rescue value if he comes back, or that, you know, I guess maybe they trigger the clause and they presumably negotiated, if it's in there, that it's a high enough fee that they're comfortable with it. But Ferguson came onto the scene almost being like this magical young forward. You're like, oh wow, he's already here. This is incredible. He's the next starting forward for whatever national team and for a Champions League team. And then he's had enough injury trouble over the last couple of years that now you're like, teams are much more wary about him. They don't know what they're getting. And in fact, in some cases, Brighton don't really know like how good he is, which is also interesting. I think they've decided that he's definitely a player that they're not necessarily trying to recover, even though they've had some needs up front too. So they'll see what happens with Graham. And it is always, it's pretty useful when you know you've got a good coach that's taken a young player and he's been a positive for him before. So that's a slightly unusual situation that they were happy to execute.
Yeah, he should be happy, I'm sure, going there. I just hope, for West Ham's sake, not that I'm a West Ham fan even, but I just hope there is an option to buy. Otherwise, it's sort of like that Tell situation. It's like you're sort of rebuilding this player from the, you know, lowest value he'll ever be, and maybe getting him back to high value, and then just, you know, Manchester United buys him, or someone else buys him next year or something.
I think there's an element of they just need to get through this season though, and they didn't have players because of the Antonio long-term problem with the car crash and everything like that. I think that they pretty desperately needed some bodies.
It's a weird one because I mean obviously it's not done, but you look at Leicester, Ipswich, and Southampton, how many points they have, their underlying numbers. It's like, what are we really doing? Is there any chance of relegation? Like, not really, but fair enough. Speaking of Manchester United, I thought Dorgu looks interesting based on what I've seen and read. I've never watched him play a minute, but looks really athletic, exciting, the right age, which is not always the case for Manchester United purchases. How do you think he slots right in at like sort of that left wing back? Because, Shaw doesn't really exist anymore.
They don't have a left, a left competent side at all. Like I think remember when Dalot was rumored to go to Real Madrid? You're like, really? Have they watched him recently? Because that doesn't make any sense.
Yep.
So Manchester United have lots of needs and lots of squad needs. Yeah. They paid a decent price for him. Like I think it was like 25 million plus some clauses. So it's not like a scary price. Yeah. But what they desperately needed was some other player with pace to be able to and understands kind of the wide wingback role to match alongside Ahmad. I think that they think Ahmad is like their anchor on the right-hand side for the long term. I'm happy to do that. They weren't comfortable with Garnacho. I think they're still not comfortable with Garnacho because he doesn't understand kind of the defensive side of it as much. And so Dorgu gives you that type of player where left-footed, naturally left-footed, able to be out there and do lots of work, physically fits immediately into the Premier League, which I think, a lot of the young players that they looked at would probably not be able to do that. So the one thing that you look at him is say that, he's so physically good that even if he's not technically exciting, like he kind of has a little bit of, who's the guy that that's at West Ham right now?
Oh, they had Wan-Bissaka.
Yeah, so he's got a little bit of that Wan-Bissaka element where like, look, you're a physical mismatch for like most of the players you're going to be up against, either for pace or for strength. And watching him, you're like, okay, I've very little doubt that he's going to fit. Now the question is like, how good is his patience? How good is his decision making? Do we think that he can learn to get better? Like Amorim is used to bringing younger players through, and because that was a consistent thing that he had to do in Portugal. Yeah. So as long as they're comfortable with all of that, I think that is an easy choice for them to make. Not least because there's just a black hole over there. Yeah. And so they needed somebody to be able to play two-way that at least can do the defending side as well as some attacking.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the floor of high athleticism at that position is sort of very, very important. Like
you could sell them on inside the same league for the same price to some middle tier team, and they happily take the same leap. So
exactly, and he can press, and he can get back, and he can get forward, and he can get back, and that it seems like based on what Ahmad's been doing, that's very important for the system to hold true.
You have to understand the attacking side of it, though, and that's one of the issues that we had seen with Dalot and others. And they had a really good segment on Monday Night Football over here, which is basically like, what we see is that Dalot's here on a Manchester United attack that's on the other side. What he needs to do is he needed to be like 40 yards upfield about the same time so that there's a balance and a tension for the opposing defense where they can't overcommit to this side because there's no one over here. Mm-hmm. And so having a player that understands that type of role, which is not that natural for a lot of English players or German players because they haven't played in that system, was something that they really needed to find.
Yeah. And he should, I don't know if he was specifically playing wingback at Lecce, but it does seem like, again, I'm just basing this off of FBref. He has fullback minutes and he has winger minutes. So it's like, he's kind of played both roles.
He's done both. He's also been inverted on the other side too. So he is capable of attacking and cutting inside should they need to be able to do that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. There's not that many more sort of headline grabbers. I mean, I thought Philogene and Ciso were interesting gets for Ipswich, who are just kind of up against it now after they, blew their big chance against Southampton.
Such a kick in the teeth for them. They did have the scruff of most of that game, and then to lose it 2-1 late. I'm not excited by Philogene, but maybe this is the right level. He's probably going to go back down to the championship next year, and that kind of made sense. Felt like he was like a PSR washing of money as he comes in last year and then goes immediately back out. So I mean, a lot of teams have done that. I think that's probably his level. He's probably going to be good at the championship, okay at the bottom of the Premier League, not much better than that.
Yeah.
Ipswich are going to need to compete next year. There are questions as to whether or not they'll have Kieran McKenna because they managed to keep him through this year, but there were plenty of offers, including potentially Champions League or potential Champions League teams. So,
yeah, and CISO I like a lot, but again, just alone, they're not really gaining much there except for this season. And then there's Essay at Palace, not Essay at Palace, who seems cool, seems right, perfectly on brand for them.
It is absolutely. It's like a Palace archetype. Let's find an excellent young physical kid from the championship that has done like good minutes in England. Like just put him in the team, and we'll train him up a little bit, and hopefully when we continue to churn through the exact same archetype in future years, so fit fine. And he's already scored, so they feel comfortable about it.
Yeah, that's their mold, and they'll sell him for a lot of money later, I'm sure. Were there any
who
other?
Are you most excited by?
I oddly I'm not a Manchester United fan. I'm excited to watch Dorgu. I think he just is the most immediate fit where I'm like, oh, this guy is just going to come in, start every match, and we're obviously they're not going to get relegated. We're just going to get to see him learn on the job. And Tell also, I think, just because the ceiling seems so ridiculously high. Spurs also are not going to get relegated.
Spurs matches as a neutral are like good popcorn matches. Yes. Much like Chelsea matches are pretty good popcorn matches for the most part. Like you feel like you're going to see some dumb mistakes. That's kind of fun. There's like an element of NASCAR about that. Like, hey, where's the car crash coming?
Totally,
we'll see
exactly.
It eventually. But also elite attackers.
Yeah, right. Elite attackers. But Villa, interesting too. I mean, aside from all the forwards you mentioned, they bring in a kid from La Liga 2 or La Liga Dos, I guess I should say, to fill in at right back. They brought in Disasi. I mean, they're just kind of like, duct tape and glue to keep the team together. But maybe they can make a Champions League run. I mean, we've seen Emery do weird stuff before. So I
feel like they're like Chelsea light right now in terms of like they've got a lot of deals. Like it doesn't necessarily feel like all those deals make sense or add up.
Yeah.
I think I'm mostly excited to watch them in Champions League and see because I do think Emery's a pretty good knockout manager. I don't think he's a great league manager, but I think he's a pretty good head coach for knockouts. And they do have a squad that is capable of competing there. Obviously, I think Marmoush and Nico Gonzalez are actually sort of top tier talent to watch. And I think that those ones, I don't know if they'll fix City because I don't think City have all the right pieces. I think they're probably too short, including, is Kusanov the answer on that side?
Yeah. And then Reese, they got is even younger than Kusanov, even less experienced than Kusanov. So that's like kind of but maybe that's a next year thing, for those guys, because I'm sure they'll cull some of their, more maybe washed up, if that's, I don't know, too harsh a word, guys.
Well, I also think the Holland extension was actually important for them. First of all, because they've got the money and the cash to be able to do that and fit it early, which is fine. But also it gives potential incoming players an anchor to know that Pep's still here. And we have one of the best center forwards in the world that's guaranteed or committed to his long-term future here. And so as we're doing this rebuild, which is fairly obvious, like we're not going to strand you. Like we're still here to be awesome, and you're going to get a chance to come in and win trophies, which I think is an important thing given how competitive the rest of the Premier League is right now. Yeah, no, it's a big sell. And obviously Rodri will be back. So they can point to, maybe. We'll see. Those are tough injuries. Like they take a long time to heal back and get to performance level. Yeah, that's true. Anyone else that you're excited about, or anyone that you were sort of surprised either didn't make a move or a player that didn't move? I think that I knew that City were going to make moves in this window. I knew that they didn't want to sit on stuff. And so I was comfortable and probably excited about theirs. I think that, Liverpool know that they are really deep in attack. And and also their center backs are so good right now. Like I watched those guys in person a couple times this season. And it's just like, they're so physically majestic and they just don't make mistakes. That they're like, all right, we're going to sit here. This is great. Maybe we'll churn some guys. We're going to go deep into all of our different cups, and we're probably going to sort of coast to a title in their slot for the first time. So they didn't feel like they needed to make any moves. United need to make a ton of moves, but it's going to be a slow process because like they really have to churn that squad. They got to get a bunch of guys out so that they have space to get players in. And so when I look at it, I thought basically the league being slightly less competitive at the very top was a dampener on certain teams. Like Arsenal felt that they couldn't move a lot. And so they didn't make a move or they were only moving for, kind of title caliber players.
There were so many rumors with Arsenal.
Always are. But
I
I felt like they didn't have a lot of cash because they did splash reasonable amounts in the summertime, and they didn't get some additional outgoing. So they their two left backs are still stuck around that they're not super excited by. So that's when there were a lot of rumors, but that didn't happen. But it gives them time to sort of stabilize. They are outstanding, and they could make a very deep run in the Champions League, especially if Saka comes back. The kids that they've gotten have basically helped save their season versus what it could have been. And that also means that there's less transfers. Now, for those people who are FPL people, you FPL people are sort of looking sidelong at the kids. Like, do I ever trust these guys? Like, are they actually going to be good? And and then like the team people and the people that follow the academies are like, yes, our kids are finally playing. We've got a good academy. Let's bring them up. So that's always like a source of tension. And when there's somebody new, it's like in American drafts in American sports. You're like, oh, there's a rookie here. Do we actually care about this guy? Probably not.
Probably
but
not.
He could be Randy Moss. And
right. You're right. Yeah. It's a flyer. It's exciting for all the unknowns, I guess. All right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's basically the rundown. I don't know if legitimately anyone will become FPL relevant. Obviously that depends on price and, if they starting all the games or don't start starting all the games, but there's definitely a lot to watch.
I think you're right. I think Dorgu's going to be a starter. Marmouche is almost certainly starting regularly. Gonzalez regular. Tell is the
maybe.
Card.
Yeah, maybe.
He's the big unknown.
Yeah, because they have Richarlison now. Solanke's hurt. Son is running on fumes. It's sort of like there is space for him to start if Ange likes him and he looks good. So, that'll be one to watch for sure. And then whoever Villa start.
That's the hardest part. Like you've got so many new attackers. Who's first choice now? I don't know.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, I think that's a good place to end it. And thanks again for coming on.
Awesome. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Cheers.